Hi, everybody. Welcome to this month's Lunch with an Immigration Lawyer with Boundless Immigration. I am Immigration Law and Policy Analyst Maggie Riley, and today we're going to do an update on what's going on in Congress and talk about the legislation and bills that we're seeing moving in the House and the Senate in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to just take a moment, let some folks join us here, and we'll dive right in just a moment. For those of you who are just joining us, hello and welcome. My name is Maggie Riley. I'm the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst for Boundless Immigration. And today we're going to be doing a legislation update. So I'll touch on a couple other updates that we've seen at the National Visa Center, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, talk a little bit about some of those backlogs that we're all so familiar with, and then jump into talking about legislation and bills that we're seeing moving in the House and Senate, and what we think might happen with those bills before the midterm elections in November. Hi, thank you everybody. It's so good to see you all. Just taking a quick minute here to let folks join our conversation. And I will do my best to answer questions as you all drop them in the chat. I won't necessarily be able to answer every question in the chat, but I will try to grab as many of those as I can. So again, finally, for the last time, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Maggie Riley, and I am the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst for Boundless Immigration. I am an immigration lawyer by training, and I work with Boundless to keep an eye on what's happening in the U.S. Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, and just to keep an eye on the general developments at USCIS, the Department of State, the National Visa Center, which functions as part of the DOS, and basically share that information with all of you so that we kind of have a more accurate picture of what's happening in the U.S. immigration system. Now, I mentioned I am an immigration lawyer. Unfortunately, I cannot answer direct immigration law questions for others. Since I do work inside the company, there are rules that limit how I can respond to certain kinds of questions. If you do have questions about your immigration situation or you're concerned about your situation, I highly recommend that you seek out an immigration attorney so that they can give you accurate advice based on your situation. But today we're going to talk about just some general stuff relating to what's happening with bills in the United States Congress. So before we do that, let's just jump in at, first of all, with the USCIS Ombudsman's report. So U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, as I'm sure you all know, is the immigration agency that handles the bulk of applications for benefits, visas, green cards, etc., for folks who want to come work and live in the United States. Each year, a separate office called the USCIS Ombudsman releases a report about basically the state of affairs of what's going on at USCIS. As you can imagine, over the last couple of years, these reports have not been especially positive. This year's 2022 report was released by the Ombudsman at the end of June. It was a 110-page document that laid out the most pervasive or sort of far-reaching problems that USCIS is experiencing. And as I'm sure you are all unsurprised to discover, the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems that the Ombudsman identified, was the backlogs and waiting times that USCIS applicants are experiencing. In fact, they referred to this as an avalanche of consequences, and for the most part, they were negative consequences. So as many of you have probably experienced personally yourselves or have friends and family members who have, these very long wait times can have negative impacts on your life as a whole. You can lose your work authorization, you might be unable to travel, you're sort of stuck in place while you're waiting for USCIS to respond to your request, approve your petition or application, and so on. So the Ombudsman, of course, rightly pointed out that these backlogs are not getting any better, unfortunately, and they did lay out several recommendations for things that USCIS can do to improve the situation. So major problems that people have really complained a lot to the agency about and have trickled up to the Ombudsman, especially relate to the Form I-765 Employment Authorization Document, or EAD. So work authorizations have been experiencing huge delays, which we've talked about here before in this conversation. And so the Ombudsman did make some recommendations about ways that USCIS could further improve the EAD application process, including further extending the receipt notice period for renewals, and so on. They made an interesting similar suggestion for advance parole, which is filed on the I-131. Advance parole, of course, is your travel document. So if you have filed a green card application on Form I-485, you have to wait for your advance parole approval before you're allowed to travel outside the country again. Otherwise, you might risk abandoning your application. The Ombudsman's recommendation on advanced parole was that USCIS begin provisionally approving advanced parole applications when they are filed concurrently with a Form I-485 adjustment of status application. So that's a whole lot of words, but basically what that's getting at is that the Ombudsman recommends that USCIS should automatically approve advanced parole travel documents when somebody files a green card application based on a family-based category, like marriage to a U.S. citizen, married to a permanent resident, and so on. Because these are generally approved, I believe the thinking goes is that this will speed up the process instead of having an additional form for USCIS officers to review and then approve. My personal opinion is that I think that USCIS should go further and should consider implementing this policy for advanced parole, but also for EAD documents in an effort to get people the work authorization they need so that they're not waiting these huge amounts of times, and also to help the general labor shortage that we're experiencing in the country. So those were some of the main recommendations in the Ombudsman's report. As I said, it's not probably a surprise to anybody here that USCIS is still struggling with backlogs. But they do seem receptive, at least to taking suggestions. And so we continue to keep our eyes on it. We hope that we get good news, or better news at least, again in the future. Now, on the topic of backlogs, the National Visa Center, which is a part of the Department of State, also released their July backlog report just a few days ago. The NBC did manage to make a small dent in the immigrant visa backlog of folks waiting to get their interviews scheduled in July. So this is good news. In June, the backlog did actually increase by a small amount. It went up by about 5,000 cases. But that is not a substantial percentage of the overall backlog because, of course, the backlog is over 400,000 cases at this point. So even though the NVC backlog did reduce slightly for July, they are now down to let me just double check the number here, 409,645 cases. They only scheduled 24,174 interviews for the month of July. So that's actually a decrease in interviews compared to what we saw earlier in the year in the last few months. So there are a few interplaying factors there about how the number of interviews was able to go down, but the number of cases in the backlog also went down. And part of that is just fewer people were ready to be scheduled for interview in July. So that sort of cut the NVC a little bit of a break. But as with the USCIS backlogs, we're really going to need to see aggressive action from the agency if they hope to make a meaningful dent in these big wait times that folks are seeing. As I said, the backlog at the NVC is still over 400,000 cases. And so even though they did clear 17,000 cases this past month, they obviously still have a long way to go. Now, for both of these two reports that I just discussed, we do have links that we'll share for where you can get some more information and read a little bit more about what I've just talked about. So keep your eyes on our Instagram later this afternoon, and you'll see those links get shared there. So those are sort of the major non-legislative updates that I have. The next big thing that a lot of you have probably heard about and already read about even this month would be the DACA hearing. So for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, as I'm sure you all are aware, that case has been in a lot of legal trouble for several years now, ever since former President Donald Trump attempted to end the program in 2017. There's been an ongoing legal battle. Since that time, the case has been up to the Supreme Court, back down to the District Court, and is now at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So after it came out of the Federal District Court, it has landed now before the Fifth Circuit. So a panel of judges heard that case at what's called oral arguments on July 6th in New Orleans. Unfortunately for DACA supporters, the Fifth Circuit Court is generally considered to be the most conservative court of appeals in the United States. And so it is not the friendliest forum for an argument or a case trying to save DACA. However, we're keeping our hopes up. It is very likely that the case, whatever happens at the Fifth Circuit, will probably go again to the Supreme Court. Both sides are very invested in their argument. So at the New Orleans court on July 6th, the state of Texas that is leading the lawsuit against to end DACA essentially argued that that they were suffering financial costs and harms from having DACA exist and having DACA holders living in their state. They did quote a study from 2019 that they said backed this up. However, the author of that study is a man named Ray Perryman, who has said on the record that the information that's been used by the state of Texas in its lawsuit has been really misrepresented. Unfortunately, despite that, the judges on the Fifth Circuit panel did seem more inclined towards the state of Texas's argument. The Department of Justice under the Biden administration, of course, is fighting to save DACA. And they have argued that Texas does not have standing to even bring this lawsuit, that they have no evidence that they're being financially harmed, along with the other states that joined Texas in the suit, and that actually ending DACA in Texas would cost the state of Texas, $6 billion in GDP annually. Whether the Fifth Circuit agrees with the Biden administration's arguments remains to be seen, but most likely we're not going to have a decision on that case for at least several weeks. Again, as I said, it did seem like the Fifth Circuit was not inclined to agree with the Biden administration and did look like it might side with the state of Texas and the others that brought the lawsuit. Again, though, I do believe that this case will eventually end up before the Supreme Court again, just because the program is extremely popular among the United States public. And of course, hundreds of thousands of people in this country, their family members and employers rely on the existence of this program. So again, with the others, we're keeping our eye on it. We'll have to just wait and see what happens, but you can absolutely count on us to share what information we do hear coming out of those hearings down in the Fifth Circuit. Okay, so all of that aside, now we can turn to the legislation. So, there are bills going on in the House and in the Senate. It's probably become a little bit overwhelming for some of you to keep track of all of this. I keep a big spreadsheet at this point to keep track of all of the amendments and bills that are going and flying around. Unfortunately, as you're also probably aware, a lot of these bills get introduced. Sometimes they even get passed, but they go on to die in the other chamber of Congress. So there have been several bills passed by the U.S. House of Representatives over the last 2 years that have not gone on to be taken up in the Senate. Likewise, there are bills in the Senate, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which was actually passed in June 2021, and then the House only is just beginning to take up now. Or sorry, I think I might have said that backwards. It was passed in the House and went to the Senate, and the Senate has been stalling. So both parties, Senate and House, are guilty of this particular dropping the ball situation that occurs. But looking at the bills, there are no standalone immigration bills right now that are moving through Congress. There are, like I said, bills that have been introduced, but for the most part, only the Farm Workforce Modernization Act is a standalone immigration bill. The rest of the immigration legislation that we're seeing are actually amendments that have been attached to other somewhat related bills. So, for example, we have the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which I just mentioned, and as well we also have the China Competition Bill, which at this point looks like it's predominantly being referred to as the Semiconductor Chips Bill or the CHIPS Bill. So we do have a couple of those that we can talk about. I'm actually going to start with the Farm Workforce Modernization Act because that is sort of the standalone immigration bill. So this one passed the House of Representatives twice and now is under negotiation in the Senate, where it does in fact face an uncertain fate. Now, what the Farm Workforce Modernization Act does, and I will just call it the Farm Workforce Act, I think, going forward here. The Farm Workforce Act essentially is to update our agricultural and hiring system for agriculture, and as well to help alleviate the high food prices that we're seeing in the United States at this time. So the main thing it would do would be allowing more workers in predominantly dairy and pork production to be able to hire H-2As year-round. So H-2A visas are generally limited to temporary short-term employment. Folks that need somebody to work for the entire year generally are not able to resource employees out of the H-2A program. So what the Farm Workforce Bill is aiming to do is allow more people to hire for longer periods of time out of that H-2A visa pool. It would also satisfy some of the goals for labor rights advocates if it were to be passed. So the bone of contention in the Senate has actually been about an additional provision which would extend a different law already on the books to allow H-2A visa holders to potentially sue an employer if the employer is breaking U.S. labor laws. So there are already laws in the United States about the Migrant and Seasonal Worker Protection Act that do protect temporary and visa workers and provide them certain rights and causes of action, which means the ability to file a lawsuit if their rights are violated or if their employer otherwise is breaking U.S. law. H-2A visa holders are specifically prevented from filing these lawsuits. So while other visa holders may be able to file lawsuits against their employers, potentially H-1B holders who are facing discrimination or other problems with their employer, H-2As do not have this opportunity. And for those who are familiar with the program, this is part of the reason that sometimes folks who are working on H-2A visas can experience a lot of workplace difficulties, discrimination, violations of their rights, and substandard working conditions that generally we wouldn't allow to occur in the United States. So many advocates feel that adding this provision is going to be very valuable for the bill, but there are members in the Senate who are balking at doing this. And some of that has to do with lobbying that has taken place by one of the large farming organizations. But there is sort of a split between different regions of the country. Farmers in the Southeast tend to be more suspicious of this right to sue that I've been talking about, often because many of them exclusively hire H-2A visa holders, and so they're not familiar with how the other laws are functioning. Folks in the West tend to be more likely to have experience working with both H-2A visas and other folks, and so they're already used to following that law, and they have less concern about it. But at the moment, despite the fact that the bill had high bipartisan support in the House, like I said, it did pass the House twice. It is hung up in the Senate, and both Democrats and Republicans in the House are starting to get frustrated because they feel this bill really needs to be passed, given the situation that we're seeing in terms of critical food supply, extremely high food costs, and of course with the midterm elections coming up, there are concerns that it will not be possible to get this bill through. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy has said he will not bring any immigration bills to the floor if the Republicans take control of the House in November. So if that happens, despite the importance of this bill for our agricultural section and for food production in the country, it does seem likely that the bill would then essentially be dead. So there is a bit of a clock on that one. Moving on, I know that was a lot to digest, but the next big bill that you may have seen in the news is the China Competition Bill. And this bill also had included some immigration amendments and provisions that were seen as boosting United States competitiveness with China. So the idea was to hopefully reduce barriers to green cards for folks with masters and PhDs in STEM programs, and basically just to really shore up a lot of these high-tech, science and medicine-driven professions that we really are in desperate need of in the United States right now. There were a few other provisions that had initially been discussed, but unfortunately for the most part, the China Competition Bill has been pretty well defanged. The bill has essentially been cut down to just a bill for semiconductor chips, of which there is a great shortage. So I don't want to say that this bill is, bad news or something that is unnecessary. But from an immigration standpoint, this is definitely a disappointment. It would have been nice to get at least something, but we're really just seeing chips, and there's going to be a large investment in creating these semiconductor chips in the United States, as well as investments in science and technology research and development. Now, obviously, we know that immigrants have been a really vital part of science and technology research and development in this country, but the bill itself contains no particular or special provisions dealing with immigration, unfortunately. And this is despite several efforts, especially in the House level, to include some of these pathways. So we're not going to see anything out of the China competition bill, unfortunately, though, as I said, we are going to see tax subsidies and investment in science and research technology here in the United States. So finally, that brings us to what I believe is most likely to be, if any immigration provisions do make it through Congress this year, they're going to happen in the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. So the NDAA is must-pass legislation. This is something that Congress passes every year, and it funds the defense of the United States. So the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, all of these organizations that sort of rely on these various aspects have a hand in crafting this legislation, the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate and so on. So the NDAA was passed by the House of Representatives last Thursday on July 14th. Now, it's a fairly sweeping bill, but the negotiations in the Senate are still ongoing, so it's not as clear what the final shape of the bill is going to look like exactly, especially when it comes to immigration provisions. Now, in the House version of the bill, there were two major groups or groups of people that are going to see benefits if this bill passes the Senate as it was written in the House. So the first was a documented Dreamers Amendment. And this was introduced by Representative Deborah K. Ross from North Carolina, and it was co-sponsored by Representative Mariannette Miller Meeks from Iowa. So this bill was bipartisan, or this amendment, excuse me, was bipartisan in scope, and it was a bill, provision to protect documented dreamers. Documented dreamers are folks that came into the United States legally as children or under the age of 18, usually with a parent who had a work visa or some other temporary visa. However, they've either aged out of eligibility for the dependent visa or their parent's status has expired and the child, probably now an adult, no longer has legal immigration status. So this bill aimed to protect documented dreamers, especially to prevent this aging out problem, which we've seen in a lot of contexts over the last couple of years as backlogs have really extended at USCIS and at the Department of State. The other group of folks that are likely to see benefits if the NDAA passes as written are Afghan special immigrant visa applicants and special immigrant visa holders. So in the wake of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, we did manage to extricate about 80,000 people from Afghanistan. However, a lot more people than that assisted the United States efforts when they were there and are in danger now due to their efforts working with foreign organizations or the United States government. Because of that, the general goal is to ease the visa application process for these people, who many of them are caught in sort of a bureaucratic nightmare of long wait times, arbitrary denials, arbitrary requests for evidence, all the general problems that many of us who work with the immigration system every day have become familiar with over the last 5 to 10 years. So essentially it would ask the Department of State or direct the Department of State to ramp up their visa application processing for Afghan special immigrant visas and as well for refugee referrals. It would also make it easier for Afghan students to obtain visas to come to the United States and study. Right now, to get an F1 visa or other student visas, a student usually needs to show that they have no intent to remain in the United States after their visa ends, and that they plan to return to their home country. Now, clearly for folks who are in this situation, who are in danger in Afghanistan, having to show show intent to return back to Afghanistan seems like an unreasonable bar at this time, and so the provision is meant to make it easier for folks to get these study visas, especially during the current time when the situation on the ground in Afghanistan is very severe and very dangerous for people. One provision that did not make it out of the House was from Representative Zoe Lofgren. She has spent a lot of time pushing not just immigration court reform, but also general STEM provisions to shore up foreign talent being able to come and work in the United States, especially during the labor shortage that I've alluded to at this point several times. So that was to speed the way for STEM immigrants to receive green cards. Unfortunately, that one did not make it through the House, and so it's unclear if the Senate will take up any immigration provisions in its version of the bill. As far as reading the tea leaves on what could happen with the NDAA, anything can happen in Congress. It's a place of wheeling and dealing, as we see all the time. I tend to be cautious about my opinion of whether something is going to pass. The Senate is currently divided 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, and while there are some Republicans that have signaled that they're on board with certain limited immigration provisions, there does tend to be division as to which provisions and how large the scope should be. Documented dreamers tend to get a better reception from certain corners in the Senate. But dreamers in general do tend to be fairly sympathetic, though as we've seen for 10 years now, that doesn't necessarily mean that legislation is going to get passed. There are certain members of the Democratic Party, despite the 50-50 split, that are more likely to vote against immigration provisions than some other Democrats would be. And so there is a chance that we could lose these immigration provisions out of the NDAA before they're passed out of the Senate. However, I will also say that if these bills made, or if these amendments and provisions made it through the House and into the Senate, there is a better chance of them passing than otherwise. As I mentioned at the beginning, the NDAA is must-pass legislation every year. And so for bills to make it through and sort of survive the editing and cutting process at the earlier levels of negotiations usually is a stronger sign that they might survive. So there's no guarantee that we're going to see these provisions pass in the NDAA, but we're expecting or hoping that we're going to see a vote coming out of the House sometime next week. And that was per a letter from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to her caucus, the Democrats, earlier this week, yesterday. So we'll keep on our eyes on that one as well. Again, there are no guarantees, unfortunately, but it is promising at least to see some people actively still communicating, negotiating on these issues, and hopefully we'll see at least some provisions make it through before we have the November midterms, at which point really it's going to get most likely much more difficult to get anything done on immigration. So those are the major legislation updates that we have right now. I did see that we had a question about DACA, and so I'll just circle back to that quickly for anybody who joined a little bit later. I talked briefly about DACA at the beginning. So DACA has been caught up in litigation for quite some time now, and on July 6th, there was an oral argument at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans in Louisiana. And so for that case, the state of Texas is sued, claiming that they're financially harmed by having DACA and DACA recipients living in their states. It's arguable that they have the evidence to back that up. The information that they cited in their lawsuit has been disputed by the person who provided the information as being reported misleadingly. On the other hand, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals did seem more inclined towards the Texas argument that DACA should be undone. The Biden administration has continued to press forward to work to save DACA. There is a rule that is supposed to come out in the month of August that would codify DACA. But regardless of what happens at the Fifth Circuit, it is likely that the DACA case will end up once again before the Supreme Court. So we will be keeping our eye on that. But at this point in time, it's probably going to be a couple weeks before we hear anything else. So K-1 visas, and I just saw one more question pop through, and I'll try to answer what I've seen. So for folks who are applying for K-1 visas, so we're switching topics a little bit here. K-1 visas are coming down in processing times from USCIS. Now, I can't quote off the top of my head, I haven't looked at the processing times this week, but my experience has been that they have come down substantially. The biggest issue is usually going to be how long is it going to wait to get an interview at Peru. So For that one, I would actually have to go and look at the Peru consulate website. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what their wait times are. But in general, we're seeing K1 visas move a lot more quickly in some regards than adjustment of status for green cards. Again, this is dependent on where you live, whether in the United States, green cards can take a really variable amount of time, but also in different countries in the world, you're gonna see longer wait times at the consulates because they're still, even at this point in 2022, still trying to recover from shutting down for the pandemic from March to at least through July of 2020, though for some consulates it was much longer than that. If you would like to send us a follow-up message, we can follow up with some more recent data, but Boundless also releases a K1 timeline blog, and we also have a embassy reopening blog, and so we can make sure we post those links as well today. We're also going to share links about the Ombudsman's report we discussed at the beginning, the National Visa Center Backlog report, and keep your eyes peeled as well because we will be posting an article about everything we talked about today with the legislative updates so that you can come back and check out that information at your own leisure. So all of that being said, I know that's a lot to take in, but you're always able to send us your questions. The social media team, our fabulous folks, are always really good about hunting down answers and working with me so that we can get your questions answered for you. So send those on in. We'll get those to you guys. And thank you so much for joining me today. I always really enjoy getting to spend time with everybody and answer some questions. And please do keep your eye on our social media for more news updates, and you can also sign up for our newsletter to learn more about immigration news, uplifting stories happening in immigrant communities around the country, and to get tips and tricks dealing with the immigration system. So thank you again so much for joining me. It's a pleasure like always, and I hope to see you all again next week at Lunch with an Immigration Lawyer. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.